Emo is a somewhat divisive term. No one can really agree on what is and what isn't emo. To some people, emo is straightened bangs, swoop to the side, skinny jeans, eyeliner. To others, it's emotional songwriting and overwrought vocals. And to a good majority of mainstream music listeners, it's kind of a joke.
What bands count as emo?
My Chemical Romance? Modern Baseball? Paramore? The term has been attached to any band that has even slightly sensitive lyrics. Or theatricality. Or they just happen to wear makeup.
Makeup is fucking great for a guy.
So no one can really agree on what bands can be emo. Is it the pop-punk theater kids or the sensitive indie hipsters? All of us have our own version of emo. Our own subsection of bands that present a different style of the genre. And that's okay. I'm not here to tell you if your emo is the right emo or the wrong emo. Listen to whatever you want. But I do have a question for all 10 of you watching. How much do you really know about emo?
I know more than you. All right.
Hello and welcome back to another video. If you're new here, I'm Trevor and I am eternally uncool. I make videos about music, music culture, and anything that interests me. But mostly music right now. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, then I highly recommend subscribing to the channel and watching the rest of this video. Emo has always fascinated me. I can remember being in middle school and high school and discovering emo. Granted, it was the most stereotypical middle school style emo, but it was my gateway. I would research the genre on Wikipedia and discover bands like Jawbreaker and Jets to Brazil and Mineral. I'd read books like Andy Greenwald's Nothing Feels Good. Throughout high school, I'd cultivate my taste with bands like Snowing and Camping in Alaska and High Tide Hotel. And of course, I also have a lot of love for bands that mainstream publications have just slapped the term emo on. I like to think that I have a pretty good working knowledge of the genre and its history. I've listened to all the landmark albums. I've read a bunch of books about the genre. I've listened to what the figureheads have said, and I've come to a conclusion. None of us can agree on what the fuck emo is, but I want to figure it out. When I first started doing videos once a week on this channel, I decided to do something super ambitious and make a video talking about the history and timeline of emo, from its roots to where it is today. Unfortunately, no one watched it. It just wasn't as good as it could have been. I couldn't encompass the entire history of emo all in one 30-minute video, you know? It's impossible. It didn't do the history of the genre any justice. What I want to do is take a deep dive into the history of emo. And I can't do it in just one video. So I'd like to be the first to introduce you to a new series on this channel I like to call Emo History Lesson. The title needs work, I know. In this series, I will look at emo's timeline, important bands and albums, significant events, and controversies. With this first installment, we're going to be looking at emo's beginnings, its roots, and the bands that pioneered the genre. I've wanted to do this series for a while now, so I hope you're as excited as I am. Without further ado, grab a drink, grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's get into the video.
I appreciate you wouldn't jump on my
Emo is short for emocore, which is short for emotional hardcore. Hardcore punk was a more aggressive subgenre of punk rock. Punk rock had been fairly melodic throughout the 70s and early 80s with bands like the Ramones and The Clash. Hardcore made everything faster and harder and more aggressive and heavy. It originated in California with bands like Black Flag, Circle Jerks, and The Germs. Just like with most scenes, hardcore spread out across the country. to places like Chicago with Naked Raygun, and New York with Bad Brains. But one of the most important hardcore scenes in the entire history of the genre was located in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The DC hardcore scene is considered to be one of the most influential. There are a lot of big bands that came up in that scene, but the most important DC hardcore band has to be Minor Threat. Minor Threat was formed in 1980 by singer Ian MacKaye and drummer Jeff Nelson. They recruited Brian Baker, Lyle Pressler, and Steve Hansgen. They were heavy proponents of DIY ethics and promoted their own music and shows, as well as releasing their own albums through the independent label Dischord, founded by MacKaye and Nelson around the same time as the band's formation. Minor Threat had a fairly short lifespan, lasting only 3 years, but they released several important EPs and compilations throughout those years, notably Out of Step and Salad Days. After the release of Out of Step, the band went on a hiatus when Lyle Pressler decided to go to college. Around this time, MacKaye and Nelson would work on their own project together, recording 2 songs. But they kept butting heads. They just couldn't agree on anything in terms of the direction of this project. And these disagreements bled into Minor Threat when they finally reunited. By the time they recorded Salad Days, Ian MacKaye was just skipping out on rehearsals, which is pretty much a sign of the end when your singer is just like,
"Screw you guys, I'm going home."
MacKaye was actually starting to have some negative feelings towards the hardcore scene. He cited a show in 1984 where a fan punched his brother and his brother punched the fan back, which made Ian realize that violence and aggression was stupid. And he was stupid for playing a part in it. Yes, hardcore punk was aggressive, but it was aggression with a message. But MacKaye saw the scene slowly devolving into meatheads just beating the shit out of each other at shows. And so he decided to just bounce. But despite Minor Threat's short-lived career, they had an indelible impact and influence. You see, there was a Minor Threat fan named Guy Picciotto who would form his own band in 1983 called Rites of Spring. Rites of Spring was part of something called Revolution Summer. This was an attempt to revive the DC hardcore scene after it had devolved into violence and misogyny and racism. The term was coined by Dischord employee Amy Pickering. She was dubbed the Mother of the Revolution and set in motion this new wave. Revolution Summer was a phrase that Pickering would put on notes that she sent around the DC hardcore scene to kind of inspire morale. This led to the Dischord label kind of forming their own little community. It embraced the ethos of hardcore and punk, but minus all the bad shit that had found its way into those genres. And Rites of Spring was one of the first bands of the revolution. Rites of Spring was formed in December of 1983 by Guy Picciotto, Brendan Canty, Mike Fellows, and Eddie Janney. They took the energy of hardcore punk and mixed it with deeply personal lyrics, essentially creating the blueprint for all emo music. The band took its name from the ballet Rites of Spring by Igor Stravinsky. Picciotto explained that he chose the name in part to revive the DC scene, saying, "We were trying to create a rebirth of what's going on here. It seemed to be stagnating for a long time, and we just thought the name kind of fit the way we felt. A springtime type of thing. They wrote some songs and released a demo in 1984 that I'm sure sounded really interesting to a punk kid in the DC scene around that time. This had the energy and visceral feel of hardcore, but the lyrics weren't political or about any social topic. They were relatable, like in an emotional way. Eventually, the band recorded their first and only album in 1985. Picciotto said about recording the album, "The record was way closer to the live experience than the first demo. It was recorded with all four of us in one tiny room, facing each other with no separation at all." The album was produced by Ian MacKaye, who would rep the band pretty hard, distributing the album through Discord, and even being the band's roadie. He really believed in the band and what they were doing, which is important to keep in mind as we go forward. Rites of Spring's self-titled album was insanely ahead of its time when it came out. It had the passion and ferociousness of the hardcore coming out of the DC scene, but with introspective and sometimes angry lyrics. And while the album wasn't a massive success at the time, it's become one of the most important and influential emo albums. It's listed as one of Kurt Cobain's favorite albums of all time. And Metal Hammer magazine listed it as one of their top 10 post-hardcore albums of all time. And it inspired Ian MacKaye. Ian MacKaye was inspired by the self-searching lyricism that Rites of Spring displayed. So much so that he wanted to try it for his own band, which led him to the formation of Embrace in 1985. Much like Rites of Spring, Embrace only released one album in their very short career. The album mixes the sound that Minor Threat had, but with lyrics that were much more introspective. Eventually, Rites of Spring and Embrace would dissolve, and their members would go on to other projects. Guy Picciotto, Brendan Canty, and Edward Janney would go on to form the band One Last Wish. Ian MacKaye and his former Minor Threat bandmate Jeff Nelson would form a kind of experimental post-hardcore type of project called Egg Hunt. But none of those projects would have the long-lasting impact that the next collaboration between Minor Threat, Embrace, and Rites of Spring members would have. To call Fugazi an emo band might not be entirely accurate, but their impact on the genre as a whole is undeniable. So I feel it's only right that I talk about them here. After Embrace dissolved, Ian MacKaye decided that he wanted to do something different. Initially, he wanted to do something that mixed Iggy and the Stooges with reggae, but he was wary about starting another project after so many misfires. He stated, "My interests were not necessarily to be in a band, but to be with people who wanted to play music with me." He would recruit bassist Joe Lally, ex-Dag Nasty drummer Colin Sear, and the three of them started jamming in 1986. Sear would go back to Dag Nasty and be replaced by Brian Canty. Canty's buddy Guy Picciotto would drop by a few rehearsals and quietly fantasize about joining the band. But he felt like he was never going to be asked. Geesh, how much more emo can you get? Picciotto would eventually be invited to join though. Mackay recruited him to sing backup vocals. Initially, Picciotto was a part-time member. He had another band at the time. But, luckily enough, that band broke up. And Ian Mackay was like,
"Hey, wanna fucking join this band?"
With the full lineup, the band would release their first EP, 7 songs, which contained the all-time classic, Waiting Room. You know, now that I think about it, this song actually does have a Stooges meets reggae vibe to it. Fugazi would really get going with their debut album, Repeater. This would be the album that most people within the punk, emo, post-hardcore world think of when they think of Fugazi. It mixes the rawness of Black Flag style hardcore with the post-punk of a band like Gang of Four. Fugazi would last much longer than any of the projects that Mackay and Picciotto had been a part of before, going from 1986 to 2003. And while they were never as appreciated in the mainstream as bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, who would appear on the scene not too long after them, Fugazi's influence has been felt immensely in the world of emo and post-hardcore and metal. Bands like At the Drive-In, Thursday, Refused, Cursive, all cite Fugazi as a major influence. And everyone from My Chemical Romance, to Rise Against, to Motion City Soundtrack, to Paramore, have all been influenced by Fugazi in some way. Without them, I don't think emo would be what it is today. Many of the bands of this era didn't use the term emo. They kinda shunned it. But what's more emo than not wanting to be called emo? What these bands in the DC hardcore scene did was set the groundwork. They set the groundwork for what emo would eventually become. And even though many of the bands that defined this burgeoning scene would split after a short time, their impact was felt in several scenes that were popping up throughout the country. I think writer Andy Greenwald said it best when he said, what had happened in DC in the mid-80s, the shift from anger to action, from extroverted rage to internal turmoil, from an individualized mass to a mass of individuals, was in many ways a test case for the transformation of the national punk scene over the next 2 decades. The imagery, the power of the music, the way the people responded to it, and the way the bands burned out instead of fading away, all had their origins in those first few performances by Rites of Spring. The roots of emo were laid, however unintentionally, by 50 or so people in the nation's capital. And in some ways, it was never as good, and surely never as pure again. Certainly the Washington scene was the only time emo-core had any definition as a genre. Emo was underground, and it would stay that way for a long time, but it wouldn't stop younger generations from starting their own scenes. This was only the beginning. Are you a fan of early emo? Did I introduce you to some new bands? Did you learn something new? Let me know in the comments. That's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then I highly recommend smashing that like button and sharing this video with everyone you know. I am a small, independent content creator who pretty much does everything on his own. Writing, editing, promoting, it's all me. So every like, every comment, every share, any interaction with this video at all really helps me out a lot. So with all that being said, thank you for watching. As always, I'm Trevor. Stay uncool. And that's the end of the video. Goodbye.